episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. Join us on our journey to learn more about the Christian faith and how we can live it out in our modern world. What does being a provider look like for the modern man? Nathan Crankfield joins us today to share his insight. Travis, over to you.
Thanks, Rigel, and thank you again to everyone for tuning in for another episode of Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. It is early in the morning. I've got a giant coffee so that we will be properly caffeinated for this conversation with Nathan. And as Rigel mentioned, we're talking about man as a provider. As always, I'm going to draw upon the wisdom of someone else to frame the conversation for us. Today, I'm going to pull from the work of Dr. Peter Klepenis, who is a licensed clinical therapist and assistant director of comprehensive counseling services. He writes, "To live a happy, fulfilling, and productive life, we need to know our primary purpose, our mission. For men, that mission is to be effective leaders, providers, and protectors. This is our nature. A woman's mission is to be an effective helper, nurturer, and comforter. That is their nature. While men and women can share these attributes, men generally gravitate towards being leaders, providers, and protectors." So that comes from Dr. Peter C. Klepenis. And to chat about this and the general topic of man as provider, we are joined by Nathan Crankfield. By way of introduction, Nathan was born and raised and baptized a Lutheran, but entered the Catholic Church at 13 years of age. He graduated from Mount St. Mary's University and later served in the 82nd Airborne Division, an airborne infantry division of the United States Army, for 3 years. After a deployment to Afghanistan, he knew it was time to pursue his love for evangelization. In 2019, he accepted a position at the Dynamic Catholic Institute, where he served as a parish consultant, and then he served as a resident director at Benedictine College in Kansas. He currently resides in Denver, Colorado, with his wife and son, and he serves as a sales lead for Hallow, the Catholic prayer and meditation app. So Nathan, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, guys, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Maybe to start us off, Nathan, can you briefly just walk us through your faith journey? You went from Lutheran to Catholic. You've been an evangelist. You work in the Catholic evangelization space. Maybe just walk us a little bit through your journey to get us started.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you kind of mentioned becoming Catholic when I was 13. I'm the youngest of my dad's 7 kids by 5 different women. And so had an interesting upbringing in that way. My dad's mom was more of like a Black Southern Baptist from Georgia. My mom's family was Lutheran. I got baptized actually the same day as my dad, even though he would go on to say that he wasn't a Christian for many years. I don't know what he would say now past, but so basically my childhood, my parents were kind of on and off from about 10 to 14, 15, and really kind of came to its pinnacle. I would say the most conflict in the house when I was around 12. Was probably the hardest year of my childhood. And so the next year was just kind of like, I've watched all these kids go through their first communion, first confession, reconciliation. Now they've all been confirmed. And I'm like, we're not going to our Lutheran church anymore. I was like, the only time I go to church is at school. And I think that I really had the gift of faith from a young age. And I was like, I want to be a part of this. I want to have, I want to be Catholic. I want to be involved in something that's bigger than me. And so, decided to become Catholic when I was 13. And then my actual conversion of heart happened later when I was at Mount St. Mary's for college, is when I really learned how to pray, committed myself to striving for chastity, which was a huge obstacle for me in my faith journey. Really started me on this path that we're going to talk about today of really discovering what does it mean to be a man? How can I become a great man?
Well, it's interesting because my father was a Baptist minister, so I grew up in a Baptist house, and then I have come to the Catholic faith as an adult. And my journey, I don't know that I had, you use the word gift there to refer to faith, and that is what it is. And I think I pushed back against that gift for far too long in my life, and thanks be to God that I found my way to the church, and wish I'd done it earlier. Looking back, 13 sounds a lot better than 39 when I got welcomed into the church, but better late than never, as they say. And I think you're right to talk about what we're discussing today, man as provider. Obviously, our own journeys of faith contribute to that. It sounds like the house that you grew up in, you experienced some conflict. There were, probably some interesting things that you can talk about and won't talk about. But maybe could you chat a little bit about your relationship with your father? You guys were baptized on the same day, but clearly you've had different faith journeys. What has your relationship with your own father done for you in terms of your perspective on a man being a provider?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my dad was a truck driver when I was growing up. And for the first 2 or 3 years of my life, he was like long distance truck driving. And so he'd be gone for 2 or 3 weeks at a time. He tells the story that there was a point at which he called home and I didn't recognize him. I didn't recognize his voice. And I was asking, like, where's my dad? And do I have a dad, to my mom sometimes and things like that, just because he'd be gone so much. And so he stopped then and started doing day trips, basically 6 days a week. He'd work 14 to 16 hours a day. And so extremely hard worker. And made good money doing that. The difficult thing that I saw growing up, we still had a lot of financial stress because of child support payments that he owed. So he owed a lot of money in child support, and then he also had a very unique approach, I'll say, to personal finance. So things like he would go out and get a new cell phone with a different carrier that would kind of like up my mother's cell phone bill because they were no longer like bundled together, things like that, or just like buy a new car spontaneously. They always had separate bank accounts, my parents, which I later found out. Once I learned that was not the way, I asked if that was how they had set up. And so there was just a lot of stress there. He gave a lot of money to his family and he had other families. And so there was a lot of money that was going out, even though there was a lot of money that was coming in. And so, it's pretty interesting to me. But basically what that led to was me getting to college as I was on this precipice of great spiritual transformation. I just was kind of like, okay, how can I kind of start from scratch to say, I don't know anything about what it means to be your best and to become the best version of yourself, what it means to be a great man. How can I kind of remove all of the expectations and the things that I've seen and the bad habits I picked up from my brothers, from my dad, and really start to kind of build this foundation of what it looks like to be a great man. And so there's I kind of call like three conversions that happened in my life. That was kind of the first one, was the spiritual aspect. The next one that happened during the tail end of my time in the Army was a political or cultural one, where I call it like my conservative conversion. The next phase of that, I would say, was largely led by my wife and dating my wife, which is kind of my family conversion, which is largely what we're talking about today.
That's really interesting. Travis and I are expecting fathers, and something we always talk about is, that we are role models for our kids, and especially if we have a little boy, then they're looking up to us as the role model on how to be a man. But it's interesting because you almost have a different approach where you've seen the model, and then you're like, maybe this doesn't work, and you've gone and tried something else. Can you maybe explain your thought process there?
Yeah, well, I would say that there was a lot of evidence that it didn't work, and so
Mm.
it wasn't hard to say, I don't think this is working out. I could see the lack of fulfillment in my dad's life. I could see the wake of pain and suffering that he left in his trail, in the different families, in my siblings who grew up largely without a father. He was most present in my life, and so I got to see what the the absence of fatherhood was for other people. And then I also got to see it, and have seen it just in my family and other families that we've been raised with, in just the ongoing effects, right? So just like his grandchildren. Now I have a nephew now who's a couple years older than me that is cross-dressing and is very lost and confused, I think. And he grew up with no father, but the only father figure in his life being my dad. And just it's things like that throughout the family, right? A lot of my sister went on to have, kids by multiple different men, and I started to see this impact of what the father can do, and how even his own sins, and I still struggle with this, right? The generational sins, I think, of lust and things like that, and how that impacts me to this day, right? And so for me, it was like, okay, I see that this does not work. I see how unhappy it makes other people. And as I started to follow in the footsteps of what my dad and my brothers were doing, namely chasing a life of pleasure, looking for, whether it was drinking or, smoking weed, whatever it was, I started to say, okay, this is fun in the moment, but I don't actually enjoy it long lasting. It's not actually leading me to be joyful. And so knowing that, and then getting to Mount St. Mary's and seeing people who were actually joyful, I said, okay, how can I actually develop this in my life and build a life that's going to lead to joy for me and for the other people in my life, and actually try to lead others to a life of joy, fulfillment, and meaning and purpose. And so that's what made it kind of easy for me to say, okay, I'm going to kind of scratch this. And then how do I totally reverse that for my son? Now I have a 14-month-old son, Jordan. So how do I become a man that when he's older, he doesn't have to do that? He doesn't have to say, okay, I'm going to scrap what my dad, showed me and displayed in the example he gave, but I'm actually going to strive to emulate what my dad did, because he was so fulfilled. He was my hero throughout my life, and really just try to reverse that. And so it's been quite the journey, but that is the goal and the mission. So hopefully we're on the right track for that.
That's awesome. I'm going to mention two things, then I'll throw a question back at you, Nathan. You highlighted there your father's career and the struggles with him being absent. My wife, and people that know my wife, is Colombian, born and raised in Colombia. She's a child refugee, so her when she was 3 or 4 years old, her parents split, unfortunately, and so she grew up effectively without a father. Her memories of her father are few and far between, and they're not good ones. The ones that she does have. And what she does remember is that her father and her brothers are quite a bit older than her. And so her brothers will tell stories. And that's largely how she knows what her father's presence or lack there was of, because he had a very similar job to, it sounds like, your father. He was a driver, driving throughout rural Colombia, very dangerous parts of Colombia too. The war was raging. And so he was away for a long, long time. And so for my wife and I, in many instances, I find myself realizing, trying to be patient and reflecting on her expectations of what a man in the house are very different than mine. My father was there every single day, no matter how busy he was present. Whereas she grew up, she's like, there was no man ever. My mom was both roles all the time. And so, I think we probably underestimate in our culture where broken families are so common and, so much more common than we even talk about because it's embarrassing for a lot of people, what that does to someone growing up surrounding their expectations. And then when they themselves, God willing, become parents, what are they prepared to see and then try to avoid doing? And I don't know that a lot of people are willing to do that. I also, like you mentioned there, your own temptations to sin and stuff. We all struggle with them. You and me would be very similar in that respect. I was interested in all the wrong things for too long. Rigel and I are in a city right now. We have the Calgary Stampede, which is, it's marketed as the greatest outdoor show on earth. There's, it's a huge outdoor event. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of family-friendly activities. There's a lot of really not family-friendly activities too. All the wrong sorts of things, drugs, alcohol. I'll use a simple example. You can go down to some of these music festivals. There's a multiple going on throughout the city throughout these 10 days. And literally in the music festival events, it's almost like a running joke where if you want, the bartenders will take your wedding ring and keep it behind the bar so that you can go and do whatever you want. And it's just kind of known and accepted. And so I think when we're in a culture like that, where marital infidelity is being actively promoted by organizers of cultural events in some instances, I think, the expectations on what it is to be a man are the barrier to being a good man is, I don't know, a lot lower than it feels like it should be. Like if you just don't cheat on your wife, it's somehow like you're a hero. And it's like, no, that doesn't make you special, or it shouldn't make you special. But in our culture, it kind of feels like that is. So I want to ask you, given that that's the culture that we're in the Western world, I know it's not that way everywhere, but in the Western world for men like us, what has your experience been becoming a man yourself, getting married, having a son? Are you encouraged by the state of our culture? Are you discouraged? And speaking to other Christians, what is your perspective on what we need to be thinking about and worrying about, knowing that this is the culture we're a part of?
I also want to just add to that question, Nathan, just because you do run your own company, Seeking Excellence, and you are part of Hallow. So keeping in mind that you also might be in an echo chamber. Tell us what you think about what you're seeing personally, and also maybe outside of your sphere. What are you seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I think to answer the first part of that, am I encouraged or discouraged? I think there's two parts to that, and kind of a little bit of each, right? So encouraged in that, if you listen, I'm a fan of Alex Hormozy. I just said a friend of mine of one of his podcasts. I'm sure you guys, being given the title of your podcast, are familiar with him and know a little bit about Hormozy. But he talks about, as many people do, that it's just easy to crush it today because so many people are so lazy, right? Like our competition is just so low. And so in that regard, kind of what Travis was pointing out is that it's easy to be an amazing man today in the eyes of most people, because just the bar is so low. And so I am slightly encouraged by that, right? By how easy it is, but discouraged by the fact that you're also this journey to manhood, right? When we think about iron sharpening iron, it is a lot easier when there is just this expectation of greatness. And being in the military, I really experienced that. I remember being in ROTC where it was just kind of like the expectations were kind of just like the minimal stuff. Sure, there were some leaders that would try to push us, but in Army ROTC, which is basically our officer training, if you're not familiar with that out there, we were in college students, so we were kind of like part-time Army preparing to be Army officers, right? And so passing the PT test, getting decent grades was kind of the expectation. Then I went to Ranger School, which is like a special operations school, and that's like the expectation is you're going to be a stud, right? You're going to be awesome. And it's a little bit easier to be awesome around people who expect to be awesome. And so that is where I think it's a little bit more discouraging. And you see the temptations, left and right, as you mentioned, that bar sounds insane where it's just encouraged. And I remember one of my most distinct memories of my adult memories with my father was being in college when I was kind of having this conversion and explaining to him, like, I was kind of trying to take a break from women because I wasn't really good at controlling myself. And he's like, no, this is the time to sow your oats. This is the time to get out there and have some fun. And so when you have that kind of experience, and I had friends who like actively would try to, you know, end my streak with chastity, if you will, and kind of be anti whatever efforts I was putting in towards holiness and virtue. That's really difficult. And it's easier to be virtuous. It's easier to be holy when there is some expectation, when there is some shame, right, towards sleeping around and especially infidelity within marriage. I would say it's both encouraging that it's easy to crush it, but it's discouraging in the fact that I think it is more difficult to be actually good, right? It's easier to be seen as good, but it's hard to be actually good. And then I think when it comes to the echo chamber, I try to be out there in the world as much as I can without being excessively out there. I think Hallow does a good job, and it's an interesting Catholic experience in that we have a very diverse staff. And so we're not a company, and I think part of the success of Hallow, I think, is largely attributed to the fact that we don't just hire you based on your Catholicity and how faithful you live out your Catholic faith, or if you're Catholic at all. Being a for-profit company, we can't hire people just based on their religion. So legally speaking. So it keeps it a little diverse there and keeps it a little bit more edgy. And I think we have some interesting conversations and diverse viewpoints at Hallow, which is helpful. And then just in my work, I think with Seeking Excellence, I get to talk with a lot of different people. And I try to reach two main audiences that have two distinctly different problems. So I try to reach the Catholic man who is very faithful, but only really cares about his Catholic faith and doesn't yet realize how that faith spills out into the other areas of his life with things like providing. And being driven in business in his professional life. And then the other side of that is the rougher guy who is driven into fitness and making money and being successful, but doesn't realize the importance of his faith. And so bringing those two together, and trying to show each of them that the other side of that is really important, helps me to reach a broad audience, and I think keeps me plugged in with the world a little bit more. But yeah, I try to never shy away from things like I go, to our public gyms to play basketball and try to get out there and have these conversations with people, so I'm not as surprised by some of the things that are happening in the world, because I think that is something that I am suited for and kind of made for, is reaching those more rugged guys, and entering into some of those parts of society.
It seems to me, Nathan, that you're kind of built to be almost like a model for in the world, but not of it. You can clearly, from your own experiences, you can speak to some of the things that are very much worldly, material, physical, and you've used the word pleasure seeking. Our culture is very hedonistic. Pleasure is taken to be almost like an ultimate end, as if somehow pleasure equals good. People will just assume that that's the case without asking deeper questions like, okay, but what is something for? Whether or not it feels good or seems good or is pleasurable isn't really the question. Is what is it for? And if you're not striving after that, then pleasure can be a big distraction, if not worse. So it seems like you're probably wired as someone that's built for that. And we need people like that. And so I love how you've talked about trying to like find a delicate balancing act between knowing the faith and holding to it, understanding it well enough, but then also appreciating that there's a lot of people who, if someone like you doesn't bring the faith to them, meet them where they're at, they're never going to seek it themselves. And we also have to love those people. We can't just love the people that are showing up faithfully in the pews every single week. And so I love how you're kind of built for and are going after those people, and we need those people in the church. Rigel, you had a question, I think.
Yeah, just to add one more comment to that, it's not just the seeking of pleasure. I feel it's the avoidance of suffering too. I think, people chase money with this idea of like, oh, if I get enough, then I will feel comfortable and I will feel more secure. And there's just sense of like we have to avoid suffering at any cost, and that seems to be like a good. But we know inherently that suffering is good for us because it enhances the human experience. That's where all the growth happens. So I don't know, maybe just somewhere along the way we got misguided. Nathan, question for you, and switching gears a little bit to actually talking about uh, men being providers for their family. What does that look like in modern society? And Travis and I were just talking before this call. I watched a YouTube video from the YouTube channel Big Think, and it was about male inequality. And it featured the author Richard Reeves, and he was talking about the economic system now. Especially if a couple splits up. It's almost always the dad that goes without seeing their kids, and the kids actually lose touch with their fathers entirely after a certain period of time. We also live in a time where I think it was about 40% of women earn more than their husbands, and so men aren't the sole breadwinner, but they're still held to that same societal standard of being the breadwinner. And in an environment where women actually have the economic freedom and independence to choose to be with a man as opposed to having to be with a man, but still having those same standards of like, oh, this man should also be making more money than me, which is becoming increasingly difficult. um, does the definition of being a provider for the family change with these economic circumstances, or does it remain the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that goes back to a lot of what we get pushback on as Catholics in general, right? Is these really old ideas, do they really apply anymore? The Bible's outdated. Does this matter anymore? And I think it's a good question. There's no doubt, I think, to recognize in the reality of the landscape of the world in which we operate today. All three of us being husbands, we can feel that in a special way. That it is more difficult, I think, than ever to live. I mean, maybe the Great Depression, you could say, like some other really, inflationary times. The Carter administration, I know, was pretty rough here in the U.S. But other than, just generally speaking, it's gotten harder to live on one income. It's gotten harder to be the sole provider. And I think, Richard Reeves and Dr. Leonard Sachs and a lot of great literature and thinkers out there have pointed out that our education system is biased towards women. We see women increasingly more in the STEM programs in the STEM fields, especially when it comes to medicine. I think now, at least in the United States, there are more women in medical school than men. And we see men doing a lot of those hard labor jobs, right, that don't make as much money. And so I think when we're seeing that, it is really difficult. But I still think that one of my favorite things to go back to is the Catechism of the Council of Trent. And so for those who don't know, it's kind of overseen by St. Charles Borromeo. And then I forget who it was, Pope St. Pius. I have it pulled up here. Pope St. Pius the 10th kind of oversaw the actual or no, excuse me, Pope St. Pius the Fifth had kind of approved it, but when it was put out, this was 500 years ago. It's kind of in response to the Protestant Reformation. But I love the breakdown that the Catechism of Council of Trent gives for the role and duties of a husband, the roles and duties of a wife. And I think the main thing that me and my wife try to hit on, or I try to hit on when it comes to these topics, we've done content on the man as a provider, stay-at-home moms, and all of those things, is that the primary role and responsibility of the husband is the part of that is being a provider. Part of the primary role and responsibility of the wife is to train up the children, right? And the domestic duties and taking care of the household. That doesn't mean that there can't be overlap in the two, right? That doesn't mean that the wife can't make some money or that the wife can't have a career. I'm not totally against wife having a career. What I think it comes down to is who's ultimately responsible for making sure that it happens, right? And so to me, that means sometimes even more than the husband being the primary breadwinner means that the husband's ensuring that we have a budget. The husband's
Mm,
ensuring that we're investing and we're being prudent with our money, right? So that we
Mm.
have more money in the future, that we're saving, right? That we're not spending unnecessarily. I think the worst scenarios and cases that we see today are men who are terrible spenders that put their wives into financial stress themselves, that don't strive to progress in their careers and don't plan their careers, with intentionality so that they can become better providers, that aren't seeking ways to cut back on saving money and seeking ways to make more money, and don't look after to see if there's a budget and just let their wives take care of the bills. Oh, she handles all that. I don't understand any of it. And it's like, it's one thing when you're a platoon leader in the infantry, there's going to be guys, my machine gunner is going to be the expert on the machine gun, right? And maybe I delegate that responsibility to caring for the machine gun to him or to my squad leader, who's my machine gun, my weapons squad leader. But I still have to have a general overview of what's happening. And I still have to have an understanding of the vision and the direction that we're going to go in order to accomplish our mission. And so that's where I think I always talk about the man's role, that we're the head of the family. And what that means is that we're given both authority and responsibility. Because when you have authority and no responsibility, you become a tyrant. When you have responsibility and no authority, that's another injustice, right? It's just the opposite way around. To be held responsible for something but have no decision-making authority is unjust. And so I think that we have to look at it in that way of just, okay, even in today's scope, how can I take grand responsibility for the provision of the family? And then am I setting my wife up to take, the majority of the responsibility for our domestic cares for the household, for the children?
I like the explanation you just gave, and I think something that's worth people reflecting on. And I've thought about this many times, just given my own family circumstances, the family that I've married into, and cultural differences as well. My wife being Colombian, Colombia versus North America, significantly more traditional in many respects. Although you also see extremes, which are kind of test the limits of what I can comprehend. But I think we can all think of examples of what is an exception to the rule. And I think a danger. So was some of our best friends. The husband is effectively a stay-at-home father now because his wife's career is lucrative enough that she can be the sole breadwinner for the family, and he has health concerns. And so it just made for them logical sense, given his health and her career path, for her to be effectively the main financial breadwinner for the family. But that's an exception to the rule. And I think what people like to do in our society is they'll point to individual instances and be like, see, what is the way things traditionally have been isn't the way it should be, as opposed to being like, oh, that's a unique exception to the general norm of man being financial provider for the family. And it happens all the time in our culture today, and it's used as examples, especially against people like us who are committed to the Christian faith and its traditions. People will use these one-off examples, and we can even get into issues like, gender dysphoria. The actual occurrence and prevalence of true gender dysphoria, you are more likely, in fact, you are like 10 times more likely to be born with a not fully formed limb than you are with gender dysphoria. So I don't know how many people you guys know who don't have fully formed limbs. I've never met someone personally in my entire life who does. So the odds of me actually having met somebody who has true gender dysphoria are so low, it's shocking. But we talk about these rare exceptions in our society as now we have to construct our entire culture around these one-off exceptions. And that's
Yes.
literally happening to us right now. So I think we can use those extreme examples to look at, okay, exceptions exist, of course, but what was the overall norm? And we don't just throw away norms in our culture because times have changed or we've progressed or whatever the case may be. And so I think for myself, as I think about it, would I love it if my wife earned $500,000 a year? Yeah, that would be great. But I don't live in that universe. I live in a universe where I actually want to be the provider for my family. And I don't want to feel bad trying to provide a life for my wife where she doesn't have to work. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And in fact, I think that's profoundly normal. Now, I know that just saying that, people will give me pushback and be like, oh, that's antiquated and that's anti-woman somehow. I don't know how it is, but people will make that argument. So Nathan, question for you. What sort of pushback do you find yourself getting as you talk about issues like man being a provider, taking that seriously, holding themselves to a higher standard? What sort of pushback do you get, and how do you push back against the pushback that you get?
I can almost hear Nathan thinking, how much time do you guys have?
Yeah, we might be breaking the 60-second rule. Oh, man. That makes me think of Brandon Tatum. I don't know if you guys know Officer Tatum on Instagram, but it does some cool content. and I really like him in regards to his race stuff. But he was reacting to a Pope Francis interview on 60 Minutes, where Pope Francis was basically, and who knows, the translation of this. I'm Pope Francis, generally a Pope Francis fan. I think he's the Pope. Like I have no schismatic tendencies or anything like that. But I think we can sometimes push back on some of the things that he opines about. This
sure.
is one of them where he was saying that like being conservative is holding on to old ideas as traditional. And Brandon Tatum was like, "Bro, you guys are the oldest church. Like your whole thing is tradition." And it's like, to me, that's what it comes down to when I'm arguing with Catholics about this kind of stuff is our whole thing is old ideas, right? Like we're based on teachings of Jesus Christ who walked the earth 2,000 years ago. And so, no, I don't throw out St. John Chrysostom and just say, you know what, he lived a very long time ago, or the Catechism about Council of Trent, that was 500 years ago. So we're just going to ignore that. Or St. Paul's words, in 1 Timothy, I think it's 1 Timothy 5, where he says that a man that doesn't provide for his relatives, especially for his own household, is worse than an unbeliever. That was a long time ago. What did St. Paul know about living in the 21st century? He didn't have an iPhone, right? And I just think it's so dumb to sit there and say, yes, I still believe in. We're basically we become Protestants in this way, I think, in a lot of ways. Where we're saying we're going to pick and choose what we like from Scripture. I'm going to ignore John 6 because it makes me uncomfortable, but the rest, of the Gospel of John is really amazing. I'm going to base my whole life on it. I don't think that we should ignore some of these old ideas, and exactly what you're saying, Travis, about the need we have for ideals, right? And that. Something I've been very convicted by is if I'm going to teach ideals, I have to, or if I'm going to talk about ideals, if I'm going to preach about ideals, I have to teach people how to reach the ideals, right? So I'm trying to give more of that actual layout of how we can do these things, and at least my journey and my experience to getting to the point of us living on one income. And it's not an easy path. It's not, I think you make a good point that the thing about ideals is it doesn't have to apply to every single situation, but we can still sit here and look at St. John Chrysostom on marriage and family life. When people lived this out, families were a lot happier, right? Society was a lot better. Society was a lot more Christian. So we can't be taking these atheistic ideas, like feminism kind of flows out of, right? That says, no, men and women should be doing the exact same things. They're exactly equal. They're exactly the same. Gender's interchangeable. And then we look at our families within the church. We're like, well, why do we have such a high divorce rate even within the church? We don't believe in divorce. We don't teach that this is okay. And it's because we've allowed these secular, atheistic, new agey ideas to infiltrate our minds and really shape the way that we view marriage and family life, right? And so being able to I saw this, there's a really funny, I can't remember, I always forget this comedian's name, but they do like basically parody podcasts, and they'll talk to each other. They're really hilarious. And they talk about how people don't understand the idea of averages. They're like, so if you say that the average man is stronger than the average woman, they'll tell you that they know a woman that's stronger than most men, right? And it's like, yes, we understand that. But for most people, and this is exactly how I feel talk about ideals, right? Just talk about how dumb people are. People can't understand what averages are, right? And I think that's the same thing with ideals. And so I get pushback every time I talk about it. When I talk about stay-at-home mothers and the goodness of that and how the church has taught the goodness of that for a long time, then it's like, well, I have a stay-at-home husband because of X, Y, or Z. And I say, okay, you may have that circumstance, and I'm not privy to all the details of your circumstance. What I believe, and I actually was listening to your guys' episode with, I think her name's Nicole, right?
Yes.
She's been on twice.
Yeah.
When she talked about this, right? When she said that I was the primary breadwinner, meaning Nicole was, but my husband was a military officer, and it was central to who he was as a man, right? Was his position in the military. And that's true, I think, for a lot of men. We don't like to talk about this. I actually just recorded a podcast about this yesterday, of that sometimes men, we get so effeminate, in my opinion, of saying like, oh, isn't it sad that we always identify with what we do for work? And I'm like, no, it's not, because that's literally like, we literally have St. Joseph the worker on May 1st, right? We literally know about St. Joseph that he was a Christian, right? That he was a believer in Jesus Christ, that and Jewish, of course. We know that he was Mary's husband, that he was Jesus's dad, and that he was a carpenter. Those are like the things we know about him, right, is what he did for work, that he had a family, his big V vocation and his little V vocation. And that's how it's going to be for most men, right? And that's not a problem. That's not something we have to feel bad about. The fact that we identify with our careers as men, because that is central to our role as husband and father, which is central to who we are as men, what we're created to be, right? So identifying with your vocation, I think, is a good thing. But I think her example there of saying this was really important to who he was as a man, and it was more important that he had that and he was a fulfilled man and husband and father than it was that we lived at 2x our lifestyle comfort, right? And not a lot of people are willing to do that and are willing to say that, and so you get a lot of pushback from people who are like, I think a lot of times, not always, but oftentimes very materialistic, want to have a high standard of living, have been accustomed to a high standard of living and don't want to release that. But I truly believe that our call to poverty within family life, we're not called to the same level of poverty as like the Franciscans, right? Or the CFRs, or Dominicans, or Benedictine monks. But our call to poverty is having an openness to that, to having a lower standard of living so that mom can stay home at least part-time, or to having as many kids, as God calls us to. This openness to life, right, is in some ways a call to poverty, because I might not get to own a boat. I might not get to drive a Lincoln or have the Corvette that I've always wanted, right? Because I might end up being called to having 6 to 8 kids. And maybe I can't afford those things because of that, or the dream house that I've always wanted. But that's okay, because that's what we're called to as Christians. We see things throughout the gospel stories of people being called to give away everything they have to follow Christ. Well, this is our small way of doing that, right? Is making some of these sacrifices. And so, yes, I get pushback on, preaching the ideals, and there's exceptions. And yes, there are some exceptions, but sometimes people are making exceptions where there shouldn't be. And they're actually just not willing to sacrifice and suffer the way that God, I think, is often calling them to. But only people can know that individually. We should never judge people's hearts, when they push back to that. But I challenge people to think about their own personal situation and say, okay, I would also like if my wife was making $200,000 a year, right, and we could, triple our income or whatever it might be from that. But I also recognize the beauty of her being home right now with Jordan, having breakfast while we're doing this.
That's amazing. You mentioned a couple things there that I want to touch on. You're spot on. People are way worse at math than even people who think they're good at math are prepared to admit. I'll use simple examples. Like study after study after study shows that if you ask people a simple question on how good they are at something versus the general population, will use driving. Something like 95% of people asked say they are better than average at driving. Well, that means that you're either wrong or you're awful at math, but it's one of those two things, because we can't have 90% of the population better than average definitionally. But time after time after time, people say that. And I think that hints at people will think about exceptions and think they're way more normal than they actually are, completely forgetting about bell curves and statistics. And so I love that you highlighted that. And we see it time after time after time. And so when it comes to our faith, people will point to the exceptions, like, yes, there might be a woman who is significantly physically stronger than her husband. But you know what? Of all the couples I know, I can think of maybe one couple where the woman actually is physically stronger than the man. And even then it would be a contest. Like, I don't actually think it's an obvious way. And it's certainly not the case in my wife still has me open the bottles of pickles and the jars of food. Like, that's just the way it is in our home. And it's that way almost everywhere. And it's not weird to point that out, but people will point to the exceptions to those things. I also really like how you were talking about poverty. And I think that and maybe that'll get us into really here, man as provider, because when we think about that in our culture, at least in the West, we're generally not subsistence farmers, right? We're generally working for an income so that we can go and buy the things that we need to provide for the material necessities of our loved ones. And so most of the time it comes down to finances. Who's going to be earning an income? What does that look like? And I think in a post-Protestant Reformation Western society, and people forget this, and us as Catholic men can look back and look at this and look at countries that were historically and remained historically Catholic, and they are generally speaking, we're talking generally here, generally speaking, less materially well off than those that adopted a Protestant mindset, right? Especially in the English-speaking world, okay? And we look at that, and there is a general tendency within the Catholic worldview versus the Protestant worldview, where Protestants tend to be much more comfortable with material wealth, material well-being. Now, I already know the committed Protestants out there are pushing back, saying, well, look how rich the Vatican is and all this stuff. False. You don't know what you're talking about, actually. The Vatican's almost bankrupt. Look at this. I'm a finance guy. I guarantee I know this better than you do, and we can have a conversation offline if you want to. But notwithstanding the things that they will point to, there is this general difference in worldviews between Catholics and Protestants, where Protestants are more comfortable with material well-being, whereas Catholics tend to more readily accept our call to poverty that you were talking about, Nathan. And yes, I know that there are a lot of Catholics who do not conform to that. Too many, I would say, actually, sadly so. But that is them being bad Catholics. Yeah, that is them being bad Catholics, them right. Not living our call to poverty. And this is something Rigel and I talk about a lot. So Nathan, with that in mind, speaking specifically to Catholics, most of whom, us included, grow up in post-Protestant, but a Protestant part of the world where Protestantism is the version of Christianity that prevails or did prevail. Do you find yourself, when talking to other Catholics, having to remind them about the reality that material comfort and material well-being is not the be-all, end-all? It's important. You are, as a man, you're called to be a provider and ensure that your children don't starve to death, as an example. But ensuring that you're driving around in a BMW and taking the fanciest vacations and stuff is not what you're called to. And too many of us think that. Do you find yourself ever having to have this conversation with Catholics that you're engaging with?
Essentially, the difference between providing and providing.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think we have to remind people of that all the time. I think, when I'm making content about any of this stuff, and even just encouraging people to have more children, right? People kind of forget that, and people will say, well, you can't live comfortably on one income. And I think it comes back to reminding people that, we're called to suffer. Or even, I've been doing content recently on men. I triggered a lot of people talking about how men shouldn't wear shorts. You guys saw some of this stuff probably on shorts to mass specifically. Not saying that you should wear shorts to the gym, but men shouldn't wear shorts to mass. And it's like, oh, but Florida's so hot and this and that. And everybody just whines and complains. And I'm like, man, I just posted yesterday. I don't know if you guys saw my LinkedIn post yesterday that came out. I was just like, I may not know you, but I bet I can guess one thing about you with 99% accuracy. And that's that your life does not need more comfort, that you're not deficient in comfort in your life, right? It's amazing how we used to have saints who lived very uncomfortable lives, right? Had never had air conditioning, that never had a warm shower in their life, that never had food delivery services, right? Or any of these things, or grocery stores to go to. And they still actively sought out more discomfort, right? St. Thomas More, who never had any of those things, still wore a hair shirt underneath his suit to work every day, or whatever, you would call the old like British garb. And it's just amazing, right? He still sought more discomfort because he realized that that's what would lead to holiness. And so I think it's incredibly important. And I think it comes back to this quote that I heard recently. One of my favorite kind of modern day thinkers out there is Dr. Arthur Brooks. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's got a session on Hallowed called The Science of Happiness. But I just listened to a podcast. He just released a new book that I need to order today. And he was on Modern Wisdom with Chris Williamson talking about the new book. And I took tons of notes on this podcast. I was like walking the dog, I was at the gym for part of it, just listen to it all day this past weekend. And the one quote that he said that I really love, that I think is really important for men out there who are thinking about this, is he says you need to have two strategies. You have to have a strategy to get more things in life, and you have to have a strategy to want less things in life. And he's like, and that's how you will diverge at ultimate happiness, right? Is to say, okay, you and I, right? All three of us, we're thinking about, okay, we have to have strategies to get more, to provide more. Why? Because I believe that we're going to have a lot of children, and hope that we're going to have a lot of children. And if we don't have a lot of children, great, we have more money to give away, right? Yep. But I have to be thinking, and inflation, if we'll see what happens in November, but if we have 4 more years of Biden, who knows what my grocery bill is going to be, $6,000 a month in 5 years. And so I got to be planning for that, right? I don't want to be blindsided by it. So I want to have a strategy for 5 years, 10 years from now to have more money coming in than I do now.
Yeah.
And so I think about it in that way. I think a lot of men are very short-sighted in thinking about money. Well, how do I make more money tomorrow? It's like, I don't know. That's going to be pretty difficult. But let's think about how we can make more money 3 years from now. And you will probably be able to get there. You can increase your income pretty substantially in that time period. But thinking about that, but then also thinking about, okay, how do we also downsize? How do we also waste less money? How do we, limit our spending? How can we set up our finances in a way that we're not just, throwing money at things that we don't need? And if you can do both of those things, you're going to end up at a pretty decent and honestly pretty comfortable space. But the last thing I'll say too on that is I have friends who, are waiting to have kids, have been married for 3 or 4 years, and they're going to Europe trips and doing all these vacations. And my thing with people is just, the Corvette or whatever is you don't understand heaven if you think going to see Rome is that important. Right. I mean,
Totally.
and I'm not anti going to Rome. I'd love to go to Rome someday, but I don't worry about my bucket list in that way. I think I saw this other great quote the other day that said, the only thing we can take with us from this life into heaven, into the afterlife, is people. And so it was just this encouragement to have as many kids as you can, because it's the only thing that you can take with you is people to heaven. And so for me, that's what I think about is like, I don't know what heaven looks like. I don't know what it's, but I bet if I'm up in heaven, I'm like, God, I never got to see St. Peter's. Either I'm going to be like, heaven is so much better that I don't even care about St. Peter's Basilica anymore, or Jesus is just going to take me to St. Peter's. Like it's one of those two things, right? Either I'm just not going to care anymore because this is so much more baller, right? Which is probably the case. I think that's 99% likely that that's the case. Or St. Peter will be like, well, let's just bop on down there, my dude. Let's go check it out. Like, you never got to see Dubai. Like, St. John Chrysostom's just going to show me around the Middle East because he's my spiritual homie, So by the time we get up there, it's like, it's just not going to matter. And we don't live for eternity. We don't have this eternal mindset. And so we just are constantly worried about today. We're constantly worried about being happy and comfortable and soft. And it's rough. It's rough, man. But
I have to throw in there that I feel like a lot of the problem is that I feel comfortable saying this because I am a cradle Catholic, but like formation is just so poor, right? I've heard parents complaining to parishes that there isn't some sort of catechesis program for students or for kids rather, and my immediate question is, well, what about you? You are the primary educator. You shouldn't be relying on someone else to form your children. And then, if we look back onto why that might be the case, well, maybe it was because both parents were working. Who's home to catechize the kids? Do you know what I mean? Then, of course, you're going to be relying on someone else to form your kids. But that is your most important duty as a parent, over providing and over expensive vacations, fancy cars, a mansion for a house. You want to form your kids in the faith, but that again is the thing. Even education of our kids, education and formation, we outsource those things in favor of both parents having a career, and sometimes even both parents have a career in order to outsource the care and education of their kids, which is just insane to me. So I feel like that somewhere along the way we've got our priorities muddled. Yeah.
My wife, or I could never do that. I could never be stay at home. And this is probably my strongest take on stay at home moms. And I think when I think about this, when I read the Catechism of the Council of Trent, when I read St. John Chrysostom, when I read St. Paul, when I read, many of the church fathers or just people who have talked about this, is in today's world, we have so many fallen away Catholics, right? I can't tell you how many moms when I'm out speaking and doing things that they come up to me and they say, hey, my son, my daughter, they're not practicing the faith anymore. What should I do? And a lot of times at that point, it's a difficult spot, right? That's not the time to get them. The time to get them is when they're, when they're children, right? When they're grade school age. But the thing that I say is the most difficult position or the most risky position for women to be in is I say that if you choose to have a career when you don't need one, and I'm talking need one, not like would like to have one or just it's what allows you to go on vacation every year across the world, but like need a career, and your children grow up and they're not practicing the faith, I think that is a bad spot for you as a woman before the eyes of God, because of the fact that we have so many things that say your primary responsibility is teaching the faith and the morals to the children, that if they grow up and they reject all of it and they're out living secular lives and just totally have abandoned God, and you just chose to work because you were not the type to stay at home, that is a dangerous place to be in. And so I think a lot of kids or a lot of moms make wise decisions when their kids are 10, 12, and they're getting in trouble in school and they're seeing some of these issues start to come up, that they say, okay, I need to be more present. And they actually start to come back. But the other thing I wanted to mention, Rigel, that you talked about there is not only do we want to outsource the education of our children when it comes to faith formation, but how often do I hear men and people complain, how many people are going to listen to this and say, well, wouldn't it be great? Why don't they teach taxes in high school? Why don't they teach financial literacy in high school? And it's like, Maybe we should, but it's not an excuse to not know anything when you're 30, right? I get maybe we should teach entrepreneurship in high school. Sure. And that's what a lot of good homeschool programs do. And you can teach your kids the best way, I think, when you do homeschool them and you have that time with them. But even if you weren't taught, like you're a grown man. I'm gonna try not to almost curse on the podcast. You're a grown individual, so you don't get to make the excuse of, well, nobody taught me, and it's so sad. And that's what my dad should have taught me, and he should have, but he didn't. So now, what are you going to do about it, right? Let's not keep complaining about what we don't have and start to seek out the answers for what we need.
100%. And that gets back to the idea of like generational sins, and but those aren't like explanations, aren't excuses. And so often, like I think and it's so easy. There's a number of books. We've recorded an episode recently with our friend Dan from the Acton Institute talking about social media, technology, the impact it's having on young minds, and we referred to the work of Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at New York University. One of his earlier works is called, I think it's The Coddling of the American Mind, I believe it is. And that you could put in almost any country in the Western world in there. It doesn't have to be American. It could have been Canadian, British, French, whatever it is. This, we're all these delicate little babies constantly. And we love to have excuses. And I think, Nathan, what you've just said is so true. Just because you can explain why you don't know something doesn't mean you have a reason to keep not knowing that thing. Whatever it is. Like, can you imagine if, we'll use an analogy because I think analogies can be helpful for a lot of people. Can you imagine if you grew up in a home where being physically active was just not part of it? No one ever showed you how to play soccer. No one ever showed you how to go to the gym. No one ever showed you how to be physically active. You're an adult now. You go to the doctor and the doctor's like, you know what? If you don't start exercising, you're going to have a heart attack and die. I don't care what your reason is for not having exercised up to that point. The doctor just told you you're going to die if you don't figure it out. And the fact that your dad never took you to the gym is not a reason to not go to the gym. You figure it out now. And there's no excuses. Your explanation is not an excuse. And I think we can see that in every avenue of life, whether it's purely secular, purely spiritual. And I think we as men need to take that seriously and model certain behaviors, especially if we know, I wish I'd been taught this. Well, we have the chance with our own children, other young people in our lives, to show how that behavior ought to be lived out and help them do so that they can't make the same excuses that so many of our peers are making today. Nathan, maybe as we get towards the end of the conversation here, I'd like to ask you for your take from two perspectives. Same question, but from two perspectives. First, I'd like your answer speaking to a Christian audience. So those people, whether Catholic or otherwise, who believe that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, that there is a God, that we owe all to him, and that we need to live our lives accordingly. That's the first audience. The second audience, because we do have listeners who are not Christians, who might know a tiny bit, but very little about the Christian faith and what we Christians profess. So from those two audiences, what advice would you have generally for men today who need to, I don't know if man up is the right phrase, but like we talked about earlier, it is so easy. The bar is so low today for a man in our culture. And that says nothing about how great we are when we take it seriously. It says everything about how bad men are in generally, that infidelity is all too easily acceptable, and it's so understandable, as a simple example. So speaking to Christian men and non-Christian men, what advice would you have for any of our listeners about how to be a better provider, a better role model, a better man in our culture today?
Absolutely. I think it comes down to, so what I teach in Seeking Excellence is these 7 pillars of excellence. And they have 3 underlying things. I call them the 3 foundations. And those are responsibility, intentionality, and courage. And so I think that those 3 things would be my starting place for honestly, for both sides. I think this is something that Jordan Peterson teaches really well, kind of from the secular perspective. Obviously ties in some scripture and stuff in his work, but thinking about responsibility, taking the extreme ownership, right? This is why people love Jocko Willink. It's this idea that you can't change anything that you don't take responsibility for. Everything you just talked about, right? With the weight loss, for example, of saying like, okay, I'm going to keep blaming other people. Well, if it's other people's fault that you're out of shape, then then you're relying on other people to get you in shape, right? If it's other people's fault that you're broke and poor, then it's going to have to be other people's responsibility to get you out of being broke and poor. And that's why a lot of people turn to the government. That's why we have this fat acceptance movement and all these things, is that we are constantly trying to remove responsibility from our lives. And you as a man will not be fulfilled if you continue to do that. We are not built and made for pawning off the responsibility for our success, whether that's just success in eating and surviving or success in becoming great in life, on other people. And so I think taking responsibility and ownership and really doing a thorough assessment of where you're currently at. And so I encourage people to go through all the 7 pillars and to assess kind of 1 to 10. How are you doing mentally? Are you continuing to grow and to learn? How are you doing physically, financially, professionally, relationally, spiritually? Rank yourself from 1 to 10, and then you can kind of get subcategories in each of those areas, but really start to take note of the areas where you're less than a 5, right? And start to say, okay, what is my game plan to get this above a 7, and start to work towards being excellent in this area of my life. And I think that's where intentionality comes in, is actually starting to take, okay, here's where I'm at. I'm taking responsibility and ownership for this. I am in this position. I am these scores because of me. What is my plan to get out of this? How can I be intentional with this? How am I going to track my progress in these areas, right? To actually say, okay, I'm going to budget once a month. I'm going to evaluate my spiritual life once a week on Sundays, right? When I sit down for Sunday Mass, I'm going to think about, I'm going to get there 5 minutes early and think about how was I spiritually, morally, how was my character for the last 7 days? Do a kind of an examine of the week. You can kind of break it down into that way and be intentional with, okay, these are the books I need to order, right? These are the order I'm going to try to read them in. I'm going to try to be intentional with my growth here. And then I think it just takes courage to actually start to do things, right? So if it's making more money, if it's starting a business or a side hustle or some type of venture, if it's going to confession when you haven't been to confession in 5 to 10 years, if it's going to the gym when you're out of shape and you're not sure what you're going to do and you're just going to try to get yourself to walk on the treadmill for 30 minutes, all of these things take courage, right? Taking action, and whether it's asking a girl out on a date, right? Or having a hard conversation with a significant other, breaking up with somebody you shouldn't be with. All of these things are going to take courage. And so you have to have courage to do these things. And I think we build courage by doing difficult tasks. And that's how we start to look fear in the face and overcome it and do the things that we need to do, regardless of the fear we're experiencing.
I actually just want to add one more thing, and this is from the Huberman Lab podcast, again, from a secular perspective. It was an episode on what actually indicates how happy you will be in life, and there were 2 main things. The first being gratitude, which pairs very nicely with our sense of worship and giving thanks to God for everything and giving all the glory to Him. But the second was agency. So having this feeling that we are actually somewhat in control of our lives, that was a strong indicator of happiness. And if we're passing that responsibility off to someone else, that we have no control over anything because we've just been disadvantaged, and we're in a position where we have no control over our lives, it's going to lead to serious unhappiness. But if you do start taking some accountability, some responsibility, that in itself, even if you don't achieve anything more, will contribute to your happiness.
I want to add 2 plugs maybe quickly here before we wrap up in prayer. For those of you listening who this has resonated at all, if you're someone that, especially as a man, if you're a woman and your husband is in need of a little motivation or help or whatever, by all means also reach out. But if you're a man who's been listening, if financial matters are complicated, stressful, burdensome, whatever it is, please feel free to send a note. I have a simple financial budgeting model that I built. I'm a finance nerd, love Microsoft Excel. I did this. I've used it to help a lot of people, including people in my own family, to help them get a grip on household finances, which I know is super stressful for so many people. Nathan has mentioned here, inflation, what that means for grocery budgets and all that kind of stuff. It's the same in Canada as in the US. So Nathan, you're not any worse off south of the border than we are up here, unfortunately. And I know that's a very normal thing to be stressed about for people. So if you're a man and you are stressed about household finances and you just need a little help to get a hold of it, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share that little financial modeling budgeting tool that I have. Secondly, I want people to take the time to go check out Nathan online. He's got a website. We're going to put the link to the information in the show notes here so that you can check out his work. What we've talked about here today is just like a tiny sample of the stuff that he talks about, grapples with. He, fearlessly talks about complex issues in our complex culture. And so I think, we're super blessed to have had him join us for this conversation, but this is just scratching the surface. To wrap us up here, I'm going to lead us in a quick prayer. So we'll do that now. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our friend Nathan, for his work, for being a voice that is needed in our culture and in our times. We pray that you would continue to bless him, his family, his growing family. May they be abundantly blessed and enriched in all the right ways. And may his focus continue to be where it ought to be. And may he strive to bring other souls to heaven. We pray that you would use this conversation for your purposes. Let us be instruments of your grace, light, and love to anyone that might hear this. And to those who have heard this, may you bless them and help them soften, convert, and open their hearts to you, to your truth, and to your church. We pray all of this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. This has been another episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. We will see you again next time. God bless.